using a throwaway for obvious reasons. Names and a few details have been changed to protect privacy, but the core of what happened is exactly as it occurred. I never planned to talk about money that night. It was my cousin's wedding. Not mine, not a business event, not a networking opportunity, just a family celebration with white tablecloths, overcooked chicken, and a DJ who thought nostalgia meant playing the same 5 songs on loop. I arrived alone, as usual. I'm the quiet one in the family. The one people vaguely remember exists but couldn't tell you what I do for a living beyond something with tech or some kind of business. That ambiguity used to bother me. Now I see it as insulation. The venue was a renovated vineyard, string lights, long wooden tables. The kind of place designed to look effortless but probably cost more than most people's annual salary just to rent for a night. I noticed the irony immediately. No one else did. My aunt hugged me a little too tightly when I arrived. My uncle clapped me on the shoulder and asked if I was still working too hard. My cousins nodded politely, already scanning the room for people they actually wanted to talk to. Standard family interactions. I took my seat, sipped the wine, listened to the speeches. Everything felt normal, boring even. I remember thinking that this was nice in a very forgettable way. The kind of night you'd struggle to recall specifics about a week later. I should have known that was about to change. Dinner was served. Dessert followed. Plates clinked. Conversations loosened. People leaned back in their chairs, satisfied and slightly drunk, which is when families tend to become their most honest. That's when I noticed the shift. It was subtle at first, a cousin asking a few more questions than usual, an uncle lingering just a little too long after saying hello, my aunt watching me with a look that felt more evaluative than affectionate. I didn't connect the dots immediately. Why would I say no one had ever cared that much before? I leaned back, fork in hand, when my aunt touched my arm. "Can we talk for a second?" she asked. Her voice was sweet, almost conspiratorial, like she was about to share a compliment or a piece of gossip. I followed her a few steps away from the table. She didn't waste time. "So," she said, lowering her voice, "I heard about your company." I blinked. "What about it?" She smiled, not warmly, calculatingly. "That you sold it," she said. "For a lot." I felt my stomach tighten. "Who told you that?" She waved her hand dismissively. "It doesn't matter. Family talks. Family talks." I nodded slowly. "Okay." Her smile widened. 8 figures, right? There it was. Not a question, a confirmation. I didn't answer. She leaned closer. "That's incredible," she said. "We're all so proud of you." That sentence should have felt good. It didn't, because it came too late. And too loaded. She continued. "You know, when someone in the family does that well, it really changes things." I waited. She glanced back toward the table where my cousins were laughing, unaware they were already being mentally itemized. "There are people here who could really use help," she said. "People who actually need it." Actually. That word did a lot of work. I felt something click into place. This wasn't celebration, it was inventory. I looked back at the table too. At the wine glasses, the expensive flowers, the venue no one here could realistically afford without stretching. And suddenly I understood. The wedding wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a context, a justification, a moment where joy quietly turned into entitlement. I smiled politely. "I didn't realize my finances were part of the program," I said. She laughed, lightly. "Oh, don't be dramatic. I just think family should support family." There it was, the thesis. Support, not congratulations, not curiosity, not pride. Support. She squeezed my arm once more and said, "We'll talk more later," before returning to the table. I stood there for a moment longer, watching her rejoin the group. I could feel eyes on me now, not admiration, assessment. And I realized something that night. Success doesn't change how people see you. It reveals how they already did. I didn't leave the wedding. That's important. Not because staying was brave, but because leaving would have been interpreted as guilt or arrogance or confirmation that I thought I was above everyone else now. I stayed because I wanted to see what happened next. Because once something cracks, you learn more by watching than by reacting. I returned to my seat with the same posture I'd had before. Same half smile, same neutral presence. But the room felt different. Like someone had turned the lights up just enough to make the dust visible. People started rotating toward me. Not abruptly, casually, one at a time. My cousin Mark sat down first. He'd barely spoken to me in years. "So I heard you had a good exit," he said, cutting into his dessert. "Yeah," I replied. "How good?" he asked. "Too quickly." "Good enough," I said. He nodded, chewing, eyes narrowing slightly as if calculating what good enough might mean in numbers. "That's awesome, man," he said. "Really awesome." He lingered a few seconds longer than necessary, then drifted away without another word. Next was my uncle. He congratulated me loudly, in front of others. Made a point of it. "This guy," he said, raising his glass, "is doing things right." I smiled. I thanked him. Then he said, "You know, I've always said you had the brains in the family." That should have sounded like praise. Instead, it sounded like positioning. A few minutes later, someone asked what I planned to do next. I said I didn't know. That answer disappointed them. Not because they cared about my future, but because uncertainty doesn't map well onto entitlement. People prefer targets. I started noticing the pattern. Compliment, pause, pivot. Every conversation curved toward need. Not always directly. Sometimes through stories, sometimes through jokes. "Oh man, if I had 8 figures, I'd never work again." One cousin laughed. "I'd finally pay off my debt." Another added. Someone mentioned their kid's tuition. Someone else joked about medical bills. It was casual, almost playful, but it wasn't random. It was testing. They weren't asking. They were probing. I gave nothing. Not because I was trying to be secretive, but because I was suddenly very aware of how quickly generosity turns into expectation once it's implied instead of offered. I'd seen this before, just not this close. I built my company quietly. No family investment. No safety net. No borrowed credibility. I didn't ask them for advice. I didn't ask them for money. I didn't even ask them for encouragement. Now, somehow, the outcome belonged to everyone. That was the part that stuck. Around coffee, my aunt returned. Different tone this time. More practical. "You must be thinking about how to structure things," she said. "Structure what?" I asked. She laughed, like I was being intentionally dense. "Giving back," she said, responsibly. I nodded slowly. "I've given back plenty." She frowned. "To strangers." The emphasis was sharp. "That doesn't count the same," she added. There it was, the unspoken rule. Charity is admirable. Family is obligatory. I took a sip of coffee. Let the silence stretch. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. She glanced around again, lowering her voice. "I'm saying this is a moment," she said. "And moments like this define people." Define, not reveal. Define. As if my character was suddenly under review. I thought about the timing. Not when I was struggling. Not when I was working 16-hour days. Not when I was taking risks with no guarantee of return. Now, at a wedding, with witnesses, I said, "I don't make financial decisions at social events." She looked surprised, then mildly offended. "Well, I didn't mean tonight," she said. "I just meant soon." Soon. I nodded again. "We'll see." She didn't like that answer. She returned to the table, and within minutes, I could feel the story being edited in real time, not rewritten, adjusted. I was no longer just successful. I was cautious, reserved, maybe even selfish. It didn't take long. The narrative didn't require facts, just implication. I watched it happen with the same detached curiosity you might have watching a storm form in the distance. You can see the pressure building long before the first crack of thunder. The bride and groom danced. People clapped, laughed. I felt strangely alone in the middle of it all, not excluded, observed. At one point, my mother leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" "Yes," I said. She studied my face. "People are talking." "I know." She hesitated. "They're proud of you." I almost laughed. Pride doesn't ask for access. I squeezed her hand gently. "I'm fine." But I wasn't thinking about comfort anymore. I was thinking about boundaries, not the kind you announce, the kind you enforce by saying less, by doing nothing, by refusing to convert celebration into obligation. I stayed until the cake was cut, until it was polite to leave. As I stood to say my goodbyes, several people hugged me harder than necessary, longer, like proximity itself might earn them something. When I stepped outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. I stood there for a moment, breathing, replaying the night. Not the wedding, the shift. I understood something then. Money doesn't change relationships. It accelerates them. And what had been revealed that night wasn't greed. It was assumption. The assumption that proximity equals entitlement. The assumption that success is communal only when it's convenient. The assumption that boundaries are negotiable if framed as family values. I drove home without music. Not angry, alert. Because once people decide your success belongs to them, the celebration is already over. The drive home was quiet enough that I could hear my own thoughts clearly, which is usually a bad sign. I replayed the evening in fragments. Not the obvious moments, the small ones, the glances that lasted a beat too long, the way conversations angled themselves toward me, and then away again once I didn't produce anything useful. The speed with which curiosity became calculation. I wasn't angry yet, I was cataloging. That night, I slept badly. Not from stress, but from vigilance. My phone buzzed once around midnight. A cousin I barely spoke to, congratulating me again and suggesting we catch up soon. I didn't reply. Not because I was avoiding them, because I was suddenly aware that every response would now be interpreted as a signal. The next morning, the wedding was still echoing through the family group chat. Photos, inside jokes, comments about the food, the usual digital debris of a shared event. Then someone tagged me. "So proud of this guy," my uncle wrote. "Proof hard work pays off." It was performative. Public. Safe. Within minutes, private messages started arriving. Nothing explicit. Just openers. "Hey, hope you got home safe. Great seeing you last night. Would love to grab coffee sometime." It wasn't the volume that unsettled me. It was the timing. I'd existed for years without triggering this level of interest. I hadn't suddenly become more charming, or more available, or more interesting. I'd become liquid. That realization took the shine off everything else. I spent the morning answering emails from my lawyer and accountant. Mundane things. Real things. The kind of work that actually followed an exit. The contrast was jarring. In one world, I was managing complexity and responsibility. In the other, I was being softly lined up as a resource. By noon, my aunt called. I let it ring. Not because I was playing games, because I wanted to see how long it would take before she left a message that explained the call, without pretending it was casual. She didn't disappoint. "Just wanted to check in," she said in the voicemail. "After everything last night, I thought it would be good to talk. No pressure. Family stuff. Family stuff." I didn't call back. Instead, I went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet. Ordinary. People walking dogs. Joggers. Someone watering plants. No one cared what I did for a living. No one was running numbers in their head while smiling at me. That felt grounding. By the time I got home, there were more messages. One from my cousin Mark. "So, totally random, but I'm looking into a business idea and would love your thoughts. You've obviously done something right." Obviously. The phrasing irritated me more than the ask itself. Not because he wanted advice, but because the advice was now framed as owed. I replied with something neutral. "Happy to share general thoughts sometime." I didn't schedule anything. The difference between generosity and obligation is whether you feel cornered. I was already feeling the walls form. Over the next few days, the pattern solidified. Everyone was still friendly, still warm, still careful to lead with praise. But the undercurrent had shifted. My success had become a reference point, a comparison tool, a justification. Someone mentioned student loans at dinner. Someone else joked about inflation. My name came up in absentia more than it ever had in person. "He's doing great now. He can afford it. He won't miss it." I wasn't present for most of these conversations. That was the problem. I found out about them secondhand. My mother mentioned casually that my aunt had been thinking about how families support each other across generations. My cousin mentioned, with a laugh, that people were half joking about me paying for the next reunion. Half joking is where entitlement hides until it's ready to surface. I started setting rules for myself. I wouldn't explain my finances. I wouldn't justify my choices. I wouldn't preemptively offer anything. If someone wanted something, they could ask directly. So far, no one had. That restraint wasn't respect. It was strategy. The first direct ask came sooner than I expected. My aunt invited me to lunch. I almost declined. Then I realized declining would only escalate the narrative, so I went. She chose a restaurant that tried very hard to feel upscale. Cloth napkins, overpriced wine. The kind of place people go when they want conversations to feel important. She talked for 15 minutes before getting anywhere near the point. Asked about my health, my plans, how I was feeling after everything. "I'm fine," I said. She nodded. "It must feel strange. All that money, all at once." "It didn't arrive all at once," I said. "And it doesn't feel like money. It feels like responsibility." She smiled. "That's very you." Then she leaned forward. "I'll be honest," she said. "People are struggling, and when someone in the family is that fortunate, it creates expectations." "There it is," I said, not unkindly. She paused. "I don't like that word." "Then don't use it," I replied. "But don't pretend it isn't what you mean," she sighed. "I'm just saying, there are things you could do that would make a real difference." "For who?" I asked. "For family," she said. I waited. "For people who actually need help," she added again, repeating the phrase like it was a moral shield. I felt something hardened then. Not my stance, my clarity. "What makes you think I haven't already helped people?" I asked. She hesitated. "I just mean, not us." I nodded slowly. "So this isn't about need. It's about proximity." She frowned. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "It's accurate." She didn't like that. The rest of lunch was polite, tense, unresolved. When we stood to leave, she hugged me and said, "I hope you don't let money change you." I smiled. I hope entitlement doesn't change us. She pulled back, startled. We didn't speak again for a while. Word travels fast in families. Faster when it's flavored with disappointment. Within a week, the tone shifted again. Less warmth, more distance. Fewer messages, fewer jokes. I was no longer just successful. I was difficult. I didn't rush to correct that, because I was starting to understand something crucial. The people who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always be the first to criticize you for setting them. And celebration, once it turns into entitlement, doesn't reverse on its own. You have to decide when the party's over. Distance didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through omissions, invitations that didn't include me, group chats that went quiet when I entered, conversations that paused half a second too long before resuming around safer topics. Nothing overt enough to confront, nothing subtle enough to miss. I'd crossed an invisible line. Not by doing something, by refusing to. I noticed how quickly people recalibrate when generosity isn't guaranteed. How praise loses enthusiasm when it doesn't lead anywhere useful. How pride turns conditional once it's no longer rewarded. The irony was that I hadn't changed my behavior much at all. I just stopped preempting. At first I wondered if I was being unfair. If I was reading malice where there was only awkwardness. Families aren't good at talking about money. Everyone knows that. Maybe this was just clumsy adjustment. Then I heard the story. Not from the source. From the echo. A cousin mentioned, offhandedly, that my aunt had said I was getting weird about things. Another relative joked that money makes people funny. Someone else said I was hard to read now. None of those statements were about what I'd done. They were about how I made people feel by not complying. That distinction mattered. I thought back to the wedding, to the exact moment the mood shifted, to how quickly celebration turned into entitlement once the information was out. No one had asked if I was happy, they'd asked what I planned to do with it. I hadn't noticed at the time how telling that was. A week later, my mother invited me over for dinner. Just me. No extended family. I went, cautiously. She cooked too much food. The table was set like it was a holiday. She was nervous. That was obvious. Halfway through the meal, she said, "Your aunt feels like you shut her down." I didn't respond immediately. "I didn't shut her down," I said finally. I declined a conversation I didn't agree to have. "She thinks you're being defensive." "I am," I said. "Defensive of my boundaries," she frowned. "You didn't used to have boundaries like this." "I used to have less clarity," I replied. She sat back, quiet for a moment. "You know people are talking," she said. "Yes. They think you've changed." "I have," I said. "I just didn't realize how much change would be required for people to accept it." She looked at me then, not with accusation, with something closer to concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. That question landed differently. "Yes," I said, "I'm actually very okay." She nodded slowly. "I don't want this to divide the family." "I don't either," I said. "But division happens when expectations go unspoken and unmet," she sighed. "They just don't understand why you wouldn't want to help." I chose my words carefully. "Helping isn't the issue," I said. "Being obligated without consent is." She didn't argue. That silence told me more than a rebuttal would have. After dinner, as she packed leftovers into containers I hadn't asked for, she said, "Your aunt thinks you owe something back." "Oh," I repeated. She didn't use that word, but that's what she meant. My mother didn't deny it. I drove home thinking about that word. Oh, it implies a debt, an imbalance, something unresolved, but I hadn't taken anything from them. I hadn't borrowed money. I hadn't leaned on them emotionally. I hadn't asked for favors or support or forgiveness. If anything, I'd existed in parallel. So what exactly did I owe? The answer was uncomfortable. I owed them access. Access to the outcome, not the effort. Access to the result, not the risk. Access to the benefit, not the burden. Once I framed it that way, everything made sense. That week, I declined 2 invitations. One to a birthday dinner, one to a casual family hang. I gave neutral reasons. Work, travel, timing. No one pushed back. But the tone changed again. Shorter replies, fewer emojis, less warmth. It wasn't punishment, it was adjustment. I'd become less useful. And usefulness, I was learning, had been the quiet currency of my place in the family. A cousin finally asked me outright. We were on the phone talking about something unrelated when he said, "Can I ask you something without you getting offended?" I almost laughed. "You can ask," I said. "Why are you being so guarded?" he said. "People just want to feel like you're still part of things." "I am part of things," I said. "I'm just not funding them." He was quiet for a second. "That's not what anyone's saying," he replied. "No," I said. "That's just what they mean." He changed the subject shortly after. I didn't bring it back. What surprised me was how calm I felt through all of this. I had expected guilt, anxiety, a sense of loss. Instead, there was relief. Because for the first time, my relationships weren't subsidized by compliance. They had to stand on their own. Some of them did, others wobbled. That wasn't cruelty, that was gravity. I thought again about the wedding, about how fast the mood had turned, how quickly people recalculated their proximity to me once money entered the room. Celebration hadn't revealed love, it had revealed entitlement. And entitlement doesn't negotiate, it resents. Once I understood that, I stopped trying to manage how anyone felt about my choices. I wasn't responsible for their disappointment. I was responsible for my integrity. The party had ended the moment my worth became transactional. Everything after that was just cleanup. Cleanup took longer than I expected, not because there was more to fix, but because people kept pretending nothing was broken. That pretense has weight. It drags conversations down, makes every interaction feel slightly off balance, like furniture moved an inch to the left and no one will admit it. I stopped attending things by default, not out of protest, out of honesty. If I didn't want to go, I didn't go. If I didn't have the energy to navigate subtext, I declined. That alone shifted the dynamic more than any conversation ever could. Availability had been mistaken for generosity. Now that it was gone, the confusion set in. My aunt tried again, this time through my mother. "She's worried about you," my mother said on the phone. "She thinks you're isolating." "I'm not," I replied. "I'm selecting." "That sounds harsh." "It's precise," I said. There was a pause. "She feels embarrassed," my mother added. "About what?" "About how that conversation went at the wedding." That surprised me. Not because of remorse, because of framing. Embarrassment implies social misstep, not moral overreach. "What does she want?" I asked. "She wants to clear the air." I considered it. Then I said, "Clearing the air requires acknowledging what was said." My mother didn't respond immediately. "I don't think she sees it the way you do," she said finally. "I know," I replied. "That's why the air stays thick." The meeting never happened. Not because I refused, because it required something they weren't ready to offer. Ownership. In the meantime, other people tried different angles. One cousin invited me to a startup pitch night, framing it as networking. Another asked if I'd take a look at a financial plan. Someone else wanted advice on real estate, casually mentioning how lucky I'd been with timing. Luck. That word came up more and more. As if effort needed to be minimized to justify entitlement, I started saying no more clearly. "I don't do that. I'm not interested. I keep my business separate from family." Each sentence felt like a small rebellion. Not because it was confrontational, but because it contradicted the version of me they were used to, the version that softened, the version that explained, the version that made things easier. That version was expensive. I hadn't realized how much I'd been paying until I stopped. One evening, I attended a smaller family dinner. No speeches, no performances, just food and conversation. It was tense. People were polite, but guarded. Topics stayed shallow. Jokes didn't land the way they used to. There was an unspoken awareness that something had changed, and no one knew how to adjust without acknowledging it. At one point, someone mentioned how money complicates things. I nodded. It clarifies them too. No one responded. After dinner, my cousin pulled me aside. "I think people feel like you're pulling away," he said. "I am," I replied. "From expectations I never agreed to." He frowned. "But family expects things." "That's the problem," I said. He didn't argue. He didn't agree either. He just looked tired. Later that night, I thought about how often family loyalty is measured by how much discomfort you're willing to tolerate without complaint. How silence is mistaken for consent. How boundaries are treated like betrayal when they disrupt access. I wasn't angry anymore. I was observant. And that observation came with an uncomfortable truth. Some relationships only survive when one person absorbs the cost. Remove that cost and what's left isn't love, it's habit. A few weeks later, my aunt sent me a long email. Not accusatory, carefully worded. She wrote about values, about how she'd grown up believing family sticks together, about how money had changed dynamics she didn't understand, about how she felt I'd misinterpreted her intentions. She didn't apologize, she reframed. I read it twice, then replied with 3 sentences. "I understand your perspective. I don't share it. I'm comfortable with where I stand." She didn't write back. The silence that followed felt final in a way nothing else had. Not dramatic, conclusive. After that, the family adjusted around my absence, not cutting me out entirely, just repositioning. I became someone people talked about rather than to. The one who sold his company. The one who's very private now. The one who doesn't like talking about money. All of those were true. None of them were insults. They were coping mechanisms. People need narratives when access is denied. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. My life outside the family was expanding. New routines, new friendships, conversations that didn't orbit my net worth or assume my availability. That contrast made everything clearer. Inside the family, my success had become a resource to be managed. Outside it, it was just context. That difference changed how I valued proximity. I wasn't rejecting my family. I was rejecting the idea that celebration entitled anyone to ownership of my outcomes. The wedding had revealed something fundamental. Joy, when filtered through scarcity, becomes claim. And once someone decides your success belongs to them, no amount of politeness will make that expectation go away. You can only outgrow it. Outgrowing something doesn't feel like winning. It feels like leaving a room you spent years learning how to survive in. I noticed it the first time a family event came and went without a single message asking if I'd be there. Not an invitation, not an update, just nothing. At first, I checked my phone more than I wanted to admit. Then I stopped, because the absence was the answer. They hadn't decided to exclude me. They'd decided not to risk the discomfort of my presence. It was easier to pretend I was busy, or distant, or uninterested. I let them. In return, I stopped carrying the weight of how my choices landed on them. The strange thing was how quickly my life filled the space. Without constant emotional bookkeeping, I had more attention for things that mattered. Work felt lighter. Conversations felt honest. I wasn't performing a version of myself designed to keep peace. Peace, I was learning, often means quiet resentment. I preferred clarity. One afternoon, my mother called again. She sounded tired. "I ran into your aunt," she said. "She asked about you." "And?" "She said she doesn't recognize you anymore." I exhaled slowly. "That's because she only knew the version of me that was useful." "That's not fair," my mother said reflexively. "It's accurate," I replied. "And accuracy doesn't care about comfort." She was quiet. "You know she loves you," my mother said. "I know she loves access," I replied. "Those aren't the same." That conversation didn't end in agreement. It ended in understanding that agreement wasn't coming. A few days later, my cousin sent me a message, longer than usual. He wrote about how things felt tense, about how people missed me, about how it didn't have to be this way. I read it carefully. Then I wrote back, "I haven't changed my values. I've changed my availability. If people only miss me when they can benefit, that's not something I can fix." He didn't respond. That was becoming a pattern. What people couldn't argue with, they avoided. The real shift happened quietly. I stopped feeling defensive. Not because the pressure disappeared, but because it stopped reaching me. Boundaries work that way. At first, they're loud, awkward, uncomfortable. Then, slowly, they train the environment. People adapt or they drift. Either way, the friction decreases. I started to see which relationships recalibrated without resentment. One cousin continued to check in without subtext. A childhood friend treated me exactly the same as before. Those connections deepened naturally, without effort. They didn't need managing. They didn't need explaining. They just existed. That contrast was instructive. The others faded. No blow-ups, no ultimatums, just a steady thinning of contact. I thought again about the wedding, about how joy had curdled into calculation the moment my success became public knowledge. Celebration doesn't reveal character. Reaction does. How people respond when they think you have something they want tells you more than how they clap when you're announced. I realized something else too. The entitlement hadn't come from nowhere. It had been rehearsed in smaller ways for years. The jokes about me covering it. The assumptions I'd help because you can. The praise that always pointed forward, toward what I might give next. I'd smiled through all of it. That was my mistake. Silence trains expectations. When I finally stopped smiling, they called it change. They were right, but not in the way they meant. The change wasn't greed. It was self-respect. I hadn't grown colder. I'd grown exact. One evening, I scrolled through photos from the wedding. I found the moment I'd been smiling, glass raised, unaware of how the night would pivot, how that smile would become a reference point for someone else's sense of entitlement. I didn't feel bitterness, just distance. Time has a way of reorganizing emotional weight. What once felt heavy, now felt instructive. I understood now that not every celebration deserves your openness. Not every room deserves your full self. And not everyone who applauds you is rooting for you. Some are just calculating proximity. The freedom came from no longer needing to manage that. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was opting out of being misunderstood on terms I didn't choose. And that choice, once made, didn't require constant defense. It just required consistency. Consistency changed the narrative faster than any explanation ever could. Not because people suddenly understood me, because they stopped expecting exceptions. When I said no, it stayed no. When I didn't respond, the silence held. When I showed up as myself, not as a resource. That predictability did something unexpected. It removed leverage. People couldn't probe for cracks if there were none. A family reunion was scheduled for late summer. A big one, the kind with rented space, matching shirts, and a group photo that would live on someone's wall for decades. I was included on the email chain. No one asked if I'd come. They assumed I wouldn't. That assumption stung less than I thought it would. It felt accurate. I replied that I wouldn't make it. No explanation, no follow-up questions. The world didn't end. A few days later, my mother sent me a picture from the reunion. Everyone smiling, arms around each other. The caption read, "Family is everything." I stared at it longer than necessary. Then I put my phone down. Slogans are easy. Boundaries are harder. The interesting thing was how little resentment I felt. I wasn't jealous of the gathering. I was aware of the trade-offs. I'd traded proximity for peace. They'd traded clarity for comfort. Neither choice was free. One afternoon, I ran into my aunt unexpectedly at a grocery store. We recognized each other at the same time. There was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Then politeness took over. We exchanged pleasantries, neutral, surface level. She asked how work was. I said it was fine. I asked about her health. She said she was doing well. There was a pause. She looked like she wanted to say something else. Then she didn't. We parted without resolution. Walking away, I felt lighter than I expected, because closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's the absence of expectation. I realized I no longer needed her to understand me. Understanding had been replaced by acceptance of distance. That was enough. The family adjusted. New dynamics formed without me. New in-jokes. New hierarchies. My name came up less often. When it did, it carried less weight. That was the final shift. When your presence stops influencing outcomes, you regain autonomy. No one was waiting on my decisions anymore. And I wasn't waiting on their approval. Around this time, something else happened. I started to talk about my work less. Not out of secrecy, out of discernment. I'd seen what visibility did in the wrong rooms. Success isn't loud. Attention is. I kept my world smaller. Not in size, in access. The people who remained were curious without expectation, supportive without agenda, comfortable without comparison. Those relationships felt clean. No emotional residue. No hidden invoices, just connection. I thought back to the moment at the wedding when my aunt had said the money should go to family who actually needs it. At the time, it had felt like a moral challenge. Now, it felt like a diagnostic question. Who defines need? Who decides responsibility? Who benefits from that definition? The answers were never about compassion. They were about control. Once I saw that, the guilt evaporated. I wasn't withholding generosity. I was refusing assignment. There's a difference. Generosity is chosen. Obligation is imposed. They look similar from the outside. They feel very different from the inside. By the end of the year, the family rhythm had reset. I was still invited to major holidays, still included in announcements, still acknowledged. But the undercurrent of expectation was gone, not because it had been resolved, because it had been starved. Entitlement doesn't survive without reinforcement, and I'd stopped feeding it. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply unavailable for narratives that required my compliance. That unavailability wasn't punishment, it was alignment. And alignment, once established, doesn't wobble when tested. It just holds. Time did what conversations couldn't. It normalized everything. Months passed without incident. No confrontations, no dramatic reconciliations. Just a new equilibrium where my presence was optional and my absence wasn't interrogated. That quiet told me the lesson had landed, not as agreement, as acceptance. I noticed how differently people spoke to me when money wasn't the subtext. When it came up at all, it was abstract, market talk, news headlines, not me. That distance was earned, and it was fragile enough that no one wanted to test it. I started seeing my family in smaller doses. One-on-one lunches, short visits, situations where expectations couldn't gather momentum. Those interactions were easier. Stripped of audience, entitlement loses confidence. My aunt and I spoke again, briefly, at a cousin's graduation. She asked about my work. I answered in general terms. She didn't push. We discussed the weather, the food, normal things. No subtext. That was new. Later my mother said, "She seems different with you." "She's adjusted," I replied. "Do you think she regrets what she said?" "I think she regrets the outcome," I said. "That's not the same." My mother didn't argue. I'd stopped needing her to defend me. That was another shift. I handled my own emotional boundaries now. One night, scrolling through old photos, I found one from years ago. A family holiday. Everyone younger, smiling easily. No tension in the frame. I studied my own expression. I looked accommodating. I remembered how tired I'd been then, back when I'd equated harmony with self-erasure. Back when I'd thought being easy was the same as being loved. That version of me had been praised often. For being helpful. For being understanding. For not making things awkward. What no one praised was the cost. I closed the photo. Growth doesn't always look like progress from the outside. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like being misunderstood and letting that misunderstanding stand. The most surprising part was how little I missed the old dynamic. I missed specific people, specific moments, not the system. The system had been unsustainable. It required one person to absorb pressure so everyone else could feel comfortable. I'd stepped out of that role, and the system hadn't collapsed. It had simply rearranged itself. That realization was sobering. I'd thought my absence would create a vacuum. It hadn't. It had created balance. People redistributed expectations, adjusted assumptions, found new ways to cope. No one starved. No one suffered. Which meant the urgency had never been real, just convenient. I stopped framing the wedding as a turning point. It wasn't the beginning of the conflict. It was the moment the truth surfaced. The entitlement hadn't been created by my success. It had been exposed by it. That distinction mattered. Success doesn't change people. It reveals what they were already prepared to claim. The longer I sat with that, the more peace I felt. Not vindication, peace. Because clarity is quieter than anger, and far more durable. Peace didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with detachment. Not the cold kind, the clear kind. The kind that lets you observe patterns without stepping into them. I started noticing the same dynamics play out elsewhere, not just in my family. In friendships. In professional circles. In rooms where someone's success tilted the atmosphere without anyone naming it. The script was always similar. Admiration first, curiosity next. Expectation after that. If the expectation was met, the admiration stayed. If it wasn't, the tone shifted. I hadn't invented this pattern. I'd just stopped participating in it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. At a dinner with old acquaintances, someone asked about my work. Another person joked about how I could pick up the tab. I smiled. Didn't respond. The joke died quickly. No follow-up. That silence told me everything. Most entitlement relies on the other person laughing along. When you don't, it has nowhere to land. I wasn't offended. I was informed. Later that night, someone pulled me aside and said, "You handled that well." "What was there to handle?" I asked. They shrugged. "You know, people get weird about money." "Yes," I said, "they do." I didn't add anything else. I didn't need to. I wasn't trying to educate anymore. I was filtering. Back with my family, the same quiet adjustments continued. My cousin announced an engagement. I sent a gift, a thoughtful one, not extravagant, not symbolic, just appropriate. No one commented on the amount. That was progress. At holidays, I showed up briefly, left early, no explanations, no apologies. I wasn't asked to contribute beyond what everyone else did. The message was clear. They'd recalibrated. Not out of understanding, out of realism. That was enough. I thought again about the phrase my aunt had used at the wedding, family who actually needs it. At the time, it had stung. Now, it sounded hollow. Need, I realized, is rarely about survival in these conversations. It's about discomfort, about wanting life to be easier without changing behavior, about outsourcing responsibility to whoever seems able to absorb it. I wasn't willing to play that role anymore, and without a willing participant, the role dissolved. I started writing again, privately. Notes, observations, patterns I didn't want to forget, not to relive the tension, to remember the clarity, because clarity fades if you don't anchor it. I wrote this down. Access is not a right. Proximity is not permission. Success is not communal property. Seeing it in words made it stick. The wedding had been loud. Everything after had been quiet. That quiet was where the real work happened, where I unlearned the reflex to smooth things over, where I stopped explaining decisions that didn't require consensus, where I accepted that being misunderstood was sometimes the price of being accurate. Accuracy costs less over time. One afternoon, my mother said something that surprised me. "You seem lighter," she said. "I am," I replied. "I worried this would harden you." "It clarified me," I said. She nodded slowly. "I can see that. That was the closest thing to validation I needed. Not agreement, recognition. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was trying to be honest. And honesty, when it disrupts expectations, often looks like distance. I was okay with that now. The celebration had turned into entitlement once. It wouldn't get the chance to do it again, because now I understood the mechanism. And once you understand a mechanism, it loses its power. Understanding the mechanism changed how I entered rooms. I no longer walked in with openness by default. Not defensively, just intentionally. I let people reveal how they related to me before I decided how much access they earned. That wasn't distrust. That was discernment. It made interactions slower but cleaner. I stopped volunteering personal milestones. Let success speak quietly, if at all. I noticed how few people asked follow-up questions once there was nothing to extract. That wasn't disappointing. It was efficient. Back with my family, something else shifted. They stopped referencing my success as a shared achievement. That subtle phrasing had disappeared. No more, "We're all so proud," followed by a pause that waited for reciprocity. Pride became standalone, unleveraged. That was progress. At a holiday dinner, my aunt mentioned a home repair she was dealing with. She didn't look at me when she said it, didn't pause, didn't angle the sentence toward implication, just information. I felt a strange relief. She wasn't testing, she was sharing. Later that night, she thanked me for coming. Nothing else, no subtext. I went home feeling oddly peaceful, because that was what normal felt like. I realized something important then. Boundaries don't punish, they normalize. They reset the baseline so interactions don't carry hidden invoices. The wedding had blown the baseline apart. Everything since had been about reconstructing it. Not through confrontation, through consistency. I thought about how easy it would have been to give in early, to write a check, to make a gesture big enough to restore the old warmth. It would have worked. Briefly. But it would have taught the wrong lesson. It would have confirmed that discomfort was an effective tactic. That celebration could be converted into claim. I'd chosen the longer road. The one with fewer smiles up front and fewer regrets later. One evening, a younger cousin asked me for advice. Career advice. Straightforward, earnest. I gave it. No strings. No assumptions. That felt good. Because generosity, when chosen freely, is clean. No resentment, no accounting. I wasn't against helping. I was against being harvested. There's a difference people don't like to acknowledge. Over time, the family learned it. Not philosophically, practically. They stopped asking questions they didn't want honest answers to. They stopped circling conversations around me. They treated my presence as presence, not potential. That change didn't come from persuasion, it came from repetition. I thought again about the moment my aunt had pulled me aside at the wedding, the confidence with which she'd framed her request, the assumption that my success had altered the moral ledger. At the time, it had felt shocking. Now, it felt predictable. That confidence didn't come from me. It came from precedent, from years of me absorbing discomfort without protest, from a pattern I'd helped create. That realization was humbling. I wasn't just correcting others, I was correcting myself, the version of me who'd mistaken harmony for health, the version who'd paid for peace with compliance. That version was gone. Not bitterly, deliberately. By the end of the year, my life felt quieter, not emptier, quieter. Fewer performative conversations, fewer loaded interactions, fewer moments of scanning for subtext. That quiet was earned, and it was worth protecting. Protecting quiet turned out to be harder than finding it. Because once you have it, you realize how many people benefited from the noise. The calls slowed first, then the texts, then the casual, thinking of you messages that never quite said why. What remained were fewer, clearer lines of connection. That thinning wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. I noticed how rarely I felt obligated anymore, how my calendar belonged to me again, how decisions didn't require emotional forecasting. When I did show up, I was present. When I didn't, I wasn't apologetic. That balance felt unfamiliar at first. Then it felt right. My family continued adapting around the absence of leverage. It showed up in small ways. No one made jokes about my paying. No one framed plans around what I could contribute. The air had cleared because the pressure had been removed. Pressure always distorts intention. Without it, motives had to stand on their own. One evening, my mother said something quietly, almost to herself. I didn't realize how much we relied on you smoothing things over. I didn't respond immediately. Neither did I said. That admission hung between us, not accusatory, revelatory. She looked at me then. I'm proud of you. Not for the exit, not for the money, for the restraint. That mattered more than anything anyone else had said, because restraint doesn't impress crowds. It unsettles them. It denies spectacle. It refuses to perform. And it costs something up front. I started seeing how often people mistake generosity for availability, how they confuse kindness with elasticity, how they assume the most accommodating person can stretch forever, until they don't. When I stopped stretching, nothing snapped. It just rebalanced. The people who stayed adjusted their posture. The ones who didn't had been leaning too hard. That wasn't cruelty. That was physics. I thought about the phrase people love to use, it takes a village. What they rarely add is, villages also need boundaries. Without them, they become extraction sites. I wasn't interested in being mined. I was interested in belonging without depletion. As the year closed, I received fewer holiday messages than before, but the ones I received were specific, thoughtful, unloaded. No hints, no expectations, just connection. I replied to every one, because that kind of connection deserves response. At a small family gathering, my aunt and I spoke again. Briefly, she asked about my health. I asked about hers. There was no edge, no tension, just mutual caution. That caution felt like respect. We didn't need reconciliation. We needed distance that didn't bruise. We had it. Walking home that night, I realized something else. The wedding hadn't ruined anything. It had accelerated what was already unstable. If success hadn't triggered entitlement, something else eventually would have. Money just speeds things up. It removes plausible deniability. People don't suddenly change when stakes rise. They reveal how they think stakes should be distributed. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And once you stop participating, the system has no choice but to adapt. I didn't win anything. I didn't lose anything essential either. What I gained was alignment. And alignment doesn't announce itself, it settles. Firmly. Alignment changed how I evaluated everything else, not just relationships, opportunities, invitations, requests that arrived dressed as compliments. I stopped asking whether something was flattering or impressive and started asking one question instead. What does this require of me long term? That filter eliminated a lot. Projects that depended on my tolerance for ambiguity. People who thrived on access without accountability. Situations where my role wasn't defined, but my responsibility was assumed. I declined more than I accepted, and every decline sharpened my sense of direction. I noticed how often people equate growth with expansion, more reach, more visibility, more obligation. But my growth looked like contraction, fewer inputs, fewer opinions, fewer emotional negotiations. That contraction didn't make my world smaller, it made it coherent. The family dynamic had trained me well for this phase, even if unintentionally. I'd learned what happens when success enters a system without boundaries. It doesn't distribute evenly, it attracts pressure. The system adapts to extract, not to support. Once I saw that, I stopped romanticizing closeness. Closeness without consent is intrusion. Connection without respect is entitlement. Those distinctions mattered now. I caught myself smiling less in public settings, not because I was unhappy, because I wasn't performing reassurance. I let silence exist. I let people sit with unanswered expectations. That silence acted like a mirror. Some people leaned in, others backed away. Both reactions were useful. One evening, a friend asked me why I seemed harder to read lately. I stopped narrating myself, I said. They nodded. That makes sense. No follow-up. No offense, just understanding. That exchange felt healthier than 100 explanations. I thought about how much energy I used to spend translating my intentions into something palatable, softening edges, preempting discomfort, managing reactions that weren't mine to manage. That energy was available now. I used it for work that mattered, for relationships that didn't require strategy, for rest that wasn't earned through exhaustion. I wasn't guarding myself anymore. I was prioritizing. And there's a difference. Guarding comes from fear. Prioritizing comes from clarity. The family had been my first lesson in that distinction. A difficult one, but a necessary one. Because if you can't hold boundaries with people who share your name, you won't hold them anywhere else. I stopped measuring success by how many people felt included. I measured it by how few felt entitled. That metric didn't trend upward socially. It trended upward internally, which was the point. The wedding felt distant now. Not erased, integrated. It had done its job. It had shown me how fast celebration curdles when access is assumed. How quickly applause turns into expectation. How important it is to decide, in advance, what you owe and what you don't. I owed honesty. I owed decency. I did not owe access to outcomes I'd built alone. That line was no longer negotiable, and because it wasn't, I didn't have to defend it anymore. Once the line stopped being negotiable, something unexpected happened. I stopped needing to rehearse it. Before, boundaries felt like something I had to prepare for, anticipate resistance, choose wording, manage tone, make sure I didn't sound ungrateful, cold, or arrogant. Now, the line existed whether or not I spoke it. That changed everything. People sensed it, not consciously, but instinctively. Conversations didn't drift toward implication anymore. Requests arrived framed clearly, or not at all. Ambiguity lost its usefulness. That's when I understood something important. The strongest boundaries are the ones you don't announce. They're the ones your behavior quietly enforces. I saw how much effort I used to waste correcting perceptions, trying to make sure people knew I was still good, still generous, still the same person, just with different circumstances. That impulse was gone. I didn't need to be seen correctly by everyone. I needed to live correctly by myself. That recalibration showed up in subtle ways. I spoke less in group settings. I listened more. I didn't fill silence with reassurance. Silence did its own sorting. Some people rushed to occupy it. Others respected it. That distinction became diagnostic. At a professional event, someone asked about my exit. I gave a high-level answer and changed the subject. They didn't push. Later, someone else leaned in and said, "I like how you don't oversell it." "I'm not selling anything," I replied. They smiled. Exactly. That moment stuck with me, because it mirrored what had happened with my family. The moment I stopped selling my availability, people stopped shopping. I wasn't withholding warmth. I was removing bait, and without bait, only genuine connection remained. Back home, I found myself revisiting old assumptions. That family closeness requires constant accommodation. That generosity must be visible to be real. That saying no damages relationships worth keeping. None of those held up anymore. The relationships that survived my no were the ones that didn't depend on my yes. That truth was inconvenient and liberating. I thought about my younger self, the one who would have written a check just to keep the mood light. Who would have rationalized it as peacekeeping? Who would have told himself it didn't matter? It mattered. Not financially, psychologically. Every time you pay to preserve comfort, you teach people what you're for. I had unlearned that lesson the hard way, but it stuck. The family dynamic had stabilized now, not because wounds healed, but because expectations recalibrated. That recalibration was fragile, but real, and it rested on one thing: consistency. I hadn't wavered. Not dramatically, just steadily. That steadiness did what arguments couldn't. It removed hope of leverage. Hope is what entitlement feeds on. Take that away, and entitlement starves quietly. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. Victory implies opposition. Grounded implies alignment. I wasn't fighting anyone anymore. I was simply standing where I stood. And, letting the ground hold, by the time I realized the lesson was finished teaching me, it had stopped hurting. That's how you know something has integrated. Not when you forgive it, not when you justify it, but when it no longer asks for emotional rent. The family settled into its new shape. Not better, not worse, just honest. There were still gatherings, still birthdays, still polite conversations that never went too deep. But the pressure was gone. No more tests disguised as jokes. No more pauses waiting to see if I'd offer. No more moral framing around what I should do. The ledger was closed, not because it was balanced, because I stopped letting people write in it. I noticed how rarely I thought about the wedding now. The memory existed, but without charge. Like a photograph you've looked at enough times that it no longer surprises you. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was data. And the data was simple. Celebration turns into entitlement when people believe proximity equals claim. That belief isn't loud at first. It hides behind warmth, behind pride, behind language that sounds communal but functions extractively. You don't see it until something valuable enters the room. Then it reveals itself. I didn't resent my aunt anymore, or my cousins, or anyone else who had adjusted their expectations poorly. They'd behaved predictably within a system I had helped maintain. I had taught them who I was by what I tolerated. When I stopped tolerating it, they learned something new. Some adapted. Some drifted. None of that required anger. Just accuracy. My life now moved with fewer explanations. When someone asked about my work, I answered briefly. When someone asked for help, I listened carefully. When someone implied obligation, I didn't respond to the implication, only to the words actually spoken. That practice filtered everything. I gave less, but what I gave was real. I helped fewer people, but the help didn't come with residue. I was no longer available for roles I hadn't agreed to play: caretaker, fixer, sponsor, buffer. Those roles had been assigned quietly over years. I'd resigned from them just as quietly. The irony was that the relationships that remained felt warmer now. Because warmth wasn't currency anymore. It was just warmth, no expectations hiding behind it, no future invoices, just presence. I understood now why so many people lose themselves after success. Not because success corrupts, but because it exposes how many people were attached to the version of you that was easy to access. When that access changes, they call it arrogance, or distance, or greed. Rarely do they call it boundaries. That's fine. Labels don't change truth. The wedding didn't teach me to distrust people. It taught me to observe reactions, to notice who celebrated without recalculating, who stayed the same, who suddenly needed justification for things they'd never earned. That awareness didn't make me cynical, it made me precise. And precision is kindness to yourself. If there was a single sentence I carried forward from all of it, it was this: you don't owe people access to the outcomes of a life they didn't build. Not family, not friends, not anyone. You owe decency. You owe honesty. You owe yourself alignment. Everything else is optional. The celebration had turned into entitlement once. It wouldn't happen again. Not because I'd hardened, but because I'd learned. And learning, when it sticks, doesn't announce itself. It just quietly changes how you walk into rooms.